My name is Andrea Wright, and I work at the Creative Arts Department at Edge Hill, and it is my very great pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's panel on Game of Thrones, understanding audience responses to a challenging TV series. Could I just ask before we start that people's got their cameras turned off, which I can see generally they have, and that you have your microphones on mute. Elka.
Sorry to interrupt very quickly, just to let everyone know that this session, as all the other ones, is being recorded. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elka. Okay, so I'm going to be passing over to Professor Fiona Atwood and Professor Clarissa Smith, who are going to be giving the papers today. So I'm going to turn my camera off and bring up this slide set for Fiona to make a start and give us an introduction to the project and the papers. Okay. Okay, are the slides up and clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, please do begin.
Okay, just hello everybody. Just to say that because we had some technical issues, Andrea is going to be operating all of our slides. So we are going to be saying change slide, please, like every 3 seconds. So bear with us. So I'm going to start by just giving a very quick introduction to the project. And then I'll carry on and talk about one aspect of the project, which is around controversies. And Clarissa will then talk about the theme of winter is coming, but we'll sort of say a bit more about that as we go along. So change slide, please, Andrea. Oh no, that's the second presentation, Andrea. So that's this is the set of slides that is for my presentation, but the shorter set of slides is the introduction. Sorry, it was a bit confusing because they started in exactly the same way. Thank you, Andrea. So between 2011 and 19, Game of Thrones was everywhere. Not only was it a very critically acclaimed series that was extremely popular and controversial, it became a real focus of interest and making. I think if you just keep pressing, Andrea, I think there's quite a bit more on the slide to come. There we go, thank you. So it was a topic of news. It became a way that people would borrow from to brand things. People were predicting what might happen. They were criticizing it. They were evaluating it. They were making theories about what would happen. There was a lot of fan production, so people creating things based on the series. And there were lots of different ways that people were engaging with the series. Huge amounts of piracy, record numbers of downloads, people binge watching, people hate watching. It was a real phenomenon, and so really interesting as a starting point for an audience research project. Next slide, please. In fact, the project itself is one of a series that have been led by Martin Barker since 2003. Clarissa and I were involved in only one of these previous projects, which was the 2011 project on porn audiences. But there's this rich history of projects aimed at engaging with audiences, aimed at developing a very distinctive kind of methodology, which Martin calls the quali-quantitative method, using both, so gathering large quantities of data and looking for patterns, but also looking in detail at often very lengthy accounts from audiences about their engagements with different series. As you'll see from the focus of these different projects, there's a strong theme here of genres associated with fantasy and Game of Thrones is kind of the latest in this. I think one of the things that has motivated the three of us in our interest in audiences is to kind of move beyond some of the standard approaches which ask about things like escapism or identification, and has tried to both get at the real detail of how people become audience members. So, where are they when they're watching things? How do they look forward to what's happening? Do they like spoilers? What are the real kind of incidental issues around their audiencehood? How does it fit with other media they're watching and so on? And then really big questions about how it might be important in terms of their identity, how they create memories around media, how media becomes a way of belonging to communities, expressing political affiliations, providing resources for kind of fantasy worlds of imagination. So, seeing the audience as something really that can really be mined in lots of different ways, and that is a very rich source of asking questions about media. Next slide, please, Andrea. So this project, Game of Thrones, involved a very large number of researchers. There were 42 academics across 14 countries who were involved in helping to disseminate the questionnaire. It was not a funded project. We all put in a small amount of money to just get the project going, but obviously it was on a very large scale. We recruited responses across a whole year, 2016 to 17, and we had over 10,000 responses from participants after the data had been cleared up. 4 years later, 5 years later, whenever it is, we now have a book, which is Watching Game of Thrones, How Audiences Engage with Dark Television. And this has been very recently published by Manchester University Press. So, we very much encourage you to look at the book. The press has always also hosted a great deal of extra information on their website. And what we're hoping is that people will engage with that, look at the data that we collected. We hope it will become a starting point for further investigation, not just of this particular series, but as part of the way we develop approaches and methods to the media audiences more generally, because that's something that we're really interested in. How do we do this kind of work, and how can it develop in future? Next slide, please, Andrea. So the main questions for this project, or some of the main questions here, we were very interested in how different kinds of audience might be engaging with a series which is really very dystopian. So what is the appeal of a series that kills off its main characters, with very little ceremony, which is relentlessly grim, often violent, gritty, grubby, which really sort of puts you through the mill while you're watching it. Why is that of such great appeal to people, and are there audiences out there? We were interested in how people situated their responses to the series among other recent offerings. Particularly, we were interested in this kind of explosion of fantasy media across a range of forms and platforms, a genre that has previously been seen as perhaps quite marginal, a bit odd, a bit niche, a bit, for kind of odd bods, but has become kind of huge and mainstream. So what's going on there? What does it mean that this genre and this series becomes so central, so big, so long-lived, and of such interest? We were interested in how people engage with characters and narrative, particularly given that one of the characteristics of the series is that it's extremely unpredictable, that the kinds of things that you might guess would happen generally don't happen. And right up until the very end, people were had all sorts of theories about what would happen, who would end up on the throne, and so on. And as you will know, I think a huge amount of outrage and anger and emotion poured out around the ending of the series, which is fascinating, because it shows how much people had invested in this narrative. We were interested in what kind of languages people used to talk about their pleasures, the meaning they found in the series, and the significance they attributed to it. And we were interested in things like how individual participants related to the controversial nature of the show. So its grimness, its violence, what some people saw as its sexualization, what some people thought of as a problematic depiction of sexual violence, and other things. So how would people situate themselves in relation to that, and how would they discuss it? So those were some of the main questions we started with. Next slide, please. Just to say a little bit about the methodology. The idea of this is that whereas most projects tend to fall into, they fall on the side of being very, very qualitative or very quantitative. We wanted to give equal consideration to both aspects. So we wanted to collect a lot of data so that we could look for patterns, so that we could measure things, and so that we could quantify things, and so that when we thought we had found significant things, we could actually put numbers against them. But we also wanted a lot of really rich data so that we could see how people might talk in detail about their own experiences and responses. Some of the data that we gathered then, for example, included people's age, sex, and class. We used some questions to measure people's responses in terms of scale. So how important was a thing, or how often did people do things? How enjoyable did they find it? And then ask people to explain those ratings so that they were giving accounts of those things in their own words. We were interested in things like the kinds of characters that people like. So who were the favourite characters and who were the favourite survivors? What was memorable, what was uncomfortable in watching, and we included some wildcard questions so that we could probe engagement of participants in more detail. And we tried to move between the two things. So we'd find a pattern, and then we would look at individual responses within those patterns, and then find more things to search from based on the individual responses we were looking at, and generate and sort of relate things backwards and forwards. So if we found a distinctive grouping of people, could we find a pattern there that showed how, whether that group chose different kinds of favourite characters to other groups, and so on. So it was a lot of movement in terms of looking at the data, moving between the kind of the big picture and then zooming in on the detail. Next slide, please, Andrea. And so these this slide just sort of spells that out in a little bit more detail, the kinds of things we were asking about. Did people like spoilers? How did they watch it? Were they with other people? Did they binge watch? Did they watch in a kind of a regular routine? What kind of series did they think it was? What did they think of the relation between the series and the book? Was that important or not? What lands and peoples did they like? What was memorable and comfortable? What were the politics, both in terms of audience members, but also how they saw politics playing out in the series? And we asked things like, what did we think? And this is the thing that Clarissa will discuss in detail. What did they think the phrase "winter is coming" meant? What this very significant idea of doom approaching? But what did that actually mean to different people? Did they interpret that in different ways? Next slide, please, Andrea. And just to sort of unpick two of those aspects in a little more detail, we were very interested in this issue of different kinds of audience within the audience. So we were interested in how people might orient themselves to the series in different ways. And we started to find patterns there. So we came up with these different categories of people. For example, participants who were really only interested in the series itself, and didn't try and do other things with it, talk about it in different ways, make different things. We found people for whom following the book was very important. And then, of course, the comparison between book and series was a major issue. We found people that were very focused on consuming things, so like merchandise or traveling to locations in which the series had been filmed. We found people who wanted to talk about the series and debate its significance. We found people who wanted to make things, so who behaved very much like fans and would create their own media, their own literature, their own artwork, and so on. And we even found a group of people who wanted to watch what fans were creating, although they didn't create things themselves. That category we actually changed later on and called it World Watchers. So that was something that did sort of evolved during the project. But just, this just gives an idea of how we are trying to just go beyond that very broad idea of an audience and see how people might operate as different kinds of audience groups within that. Another aspect that we're very interested in, next slide, Andrea, was the issue of fantasy. And as I've mentioned, a general interest in fantasy has run through all of these projects that Martin Barker has led over the years. In the instance of Game of Thrones, we wanted to see how the term fantasy was used by participants. And we found different dimensions of fantasy. So people were using that term in different ways. So sometimes it was related to kind of seeing fantasy as a limited kind of thing. It's only fantasy. It's not important. Other people saw the fantasy elements of the show as being very important, so they could shed light on the world that we live in, to national events, or to changes around the climate or migration or big political shifts, the rise of Trump, for example. Some people were interested in fantasy as a genre, and what kind of fantasy that was, so how it was different to other kinds of fantasy genres, what its characteristics were, and how it felt differently, what it allowed people to see or experience. And other people found it a way of creating community. So it's something we can talk about, we can speculate about, we can make theories about. So those are the kind of two examples, I suppose, of what we found and what interested us as we went along. Next slide, please, Andrea. More generally, I think our mission was to also reflect on what we think audience research is, and what it can reveal. And I think certainly by using the approach that we adopted, it's allowed us to capture that kind of sense of unpredictability, that people are very individual in their orientations towards media, but at the same time there are patterns, there are groupings, there are things that you can find and quantify and track down, and that approach is really fascinating for allowing both of those elements to be seen. We're also interested in the way this kind of project can shed light on the broader development of audience research and audience studies. So, the way that audiences are thought of, and the kinds of terms that have become important. So, when people talk about escapism, or when they talk about identifying with characters, those kind of large theoretical concepts, does this sort of project shed any light on that? Does it dispel the validity of those terms or those ideas about how audiences work? So what can it contribute to the bigger picture? Okay, so I think that kind of gives enough of a flavour, really, of what the project was about generally. I'm going to Clarissa. Do you want to add anything here?
Not at the moment. I think you've given a good overview, and maybe some of these things will come out in our individual papers, won't they? I mean, I will be talking a bit about some patterns and ideas around fantasy and its relation to thinking metaphorically about the series. So I think you give a great overview. Maybe people will ask some questions at the end.
Okay, lovely. All right, so I'll move on to the aspect that I wanted to talk about. And so this relates to the aspect of the project that was about controversies and the controversial nature of the show, the way that people fought over certain representations, which of course is part of the pleasure of the series, that it's something that can be argued about and debated. And how people take sides about issues. The particular part of that I'm going to concentrate on here is the representation of women in Game of Thrones, and then I'll talk in more detail about how sexual violence was represented in the series, and the three particular scenes that became very debated in public and by academics, which were three rapes, and the rape of Sansa Stark, which became a kind of real site for thinking about these issues around controversy, around exploitation, around the way that women are represented, and around the kind of this real concern and fascination with sexual violence. Okay, so I think just to sort of put it in the broadest possible context, although Game of Thrones was talked about in lots of different ways, probably the way that people most often talked about it can be situated in terms of this idea of a politics of representation. And that often played out in quite a sort of predictable and old-fashioned way, really. So, you know, is this negative or positive representation? And often the series was seen as having very positive representations, you know, of disability, for example. So making a little person the real hero of the series, having people who are injured and crippled and wounded playing significant roles. I think out of all of those kinds of discussions about whether the show was presenting groups of people positively and negatively, it was most common that interest focused on the way that women were represented. And quite often women were seen as being very empowered, and this term empowered is used a lot, that the series is empowering to women, it shows them as inspirational, as powerful. But at the same time, people would also argue that, next slide please, Andrea, people would also argue that women were shown as victimized or objectified and so on. So these are just some kind of, you know, there's millions of headlines like this. It's a tale of female empowerment. Women are the true heroes of Game of Thrones. Next slide, please, Andrea. And often the kinds of female figures that are focused on in this kind of argument that women are empowering were women as warriors, women being fierce and fighting, and, you know, really taking a lead in terms of being very active. Next slide, please, Andrea. Or that they were expert plotters and schemers, women who wanted to occupy powerful positions, who wanted to sit on the throne, and were prepared to devote their lives to doing that and to be real players in this Game of Thrones. And, you know, even though, you know, we're in the 21st century, there still aren't huge amounts of representations of women doing this thing. So there was you know, an enormous amount of approval of this kind of representation of women with dragons, with swords, with ambitions to rule the world. Next slide, please, Andrea. So alongside that kind of public and academic debate about powerful women, we found that many participants also saw female characters in Game of Thrones in this way as being very empowered and very empowering. So, for example, Cersei was described as proud, determined, brave, cunning, brilliant. Daenerys as strong, fair, kind. Arya as a badass, as independent, as resilient, as fierce and clever. So this aspect of women's really kind of active and powerful characteristics were, something that many participants really responded well to. Next slide, please, Arya. Arya, next slide, please. But this presentation of women's power also became criticism, the focus of criticism, and that happened particularly in the final season, and particularly around the presentation as Daenerys as she moves closer to the Iron Throne and is a real key contender. Many people were very disappointed to find that she would then appear to turn into this kind of mad queen, bent on destruction, power crazed, willing to kill, and so on. So that idea of women as empowering, as very strong and powerful and active, had this kind of flip side to it as well, that it could turn negative. Next slide, please, Andrea. Another thread in the discussion of women, and actually its opposite, was that Game of Thrones was constantly abusing and mistreating its women. It let them down, it betrayed them. There were a number of reasons given for this. You can see here from the second headline, people felt let down because you had Brienne, previously a very strong, calm character, weeping over a man. You had Daenerys, the powerful queen, appearing to be unstable. But I think probably throughout all the series, the major criticism of the way that women were represented focused on things like the idea that women were being sexualized. So lots of brothel scenes, women much more often than men shown as naked, having sex, being flirtatious, being seductive, and so on. And that women were subjected to sexual violence. And of course, this is within the context of a very violent series. So all kinds of violence being meted out to everybody, from animals to old people to children and so on. But the sexual violence, the aspect of sexual violence, was a particular concern when people talked about the way that women were represented. Next slide, please, Andrea. And so this idea of the series showing women as being very strong, but at the same time, that strength and their success, their ability to gain power being predicated on surviving sexual exploitation, is a real theme in debate about the series. And if you go back and you look at what's been written and discussed about the way that women are represented, that there is a real range of things that people focus on. But over and over again, people are focusing on the way that sexual activity is represented, sex work, the way the series might be sexist, and particularly how the series represented sexual violence and rape. Within that strand of discussion, three particular scenes attracted attention and became kind of flashpoints really for talking about the series' abuse or exploitation of women. And these were rapes of Daenerys, of Cersei, and of Sansa. Next slide, please. So particular scenes became a focus of attention. And if you look at the way that those scenes were discussed, certain issues are repeated over and over again. So, for example, people were concerned about the way that those scenes had been adapted from the book and the kinds of aesthetic we used in presenting them. So, if you look at the presentation of those scenes in the books, They are in the series presented in a much more graphic way. They're much more direct. They're much more central. So violence against women is kind of really foregrounded. It's very upfront. Rapes are set in the present rather than in the past. They don't happen off stage. They're not things that people are remembering. They're right there. They're very kind of in your face. There was concern that rapes weren't punished as much as they were in the books, so that the kind of the moral framing of rape was seemed different in the series, wasn't framed as problematic. Often the adaptation took a scene featuring the rape of a minor character and made it about a major female character, or scenes that were of consensual sex in the book were turned into scenes of rape. And so those kinds of changes were seen as particularly problematic. And this was exacerbated also by the kind of aesthetic associated with HBO, which is excessive, which is spectacular and sensationalist and graphic and so on. So the issue of moving from book to screen and this particular issue around aesthetics of excess became a central concern about the way that rapes were represented. Next slide, Andrea. Amongst all of this discussion, perhaps the key focus centred on the character of Sansa Stark and her rape by her newlywed husband, Ramsay Bolton. And so that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this presentation. I'm going to talk about Sansa as a character. I'm going to talk about how our participants rated her scene as an uncomfortable scene, and I'm going to look in some detail at some participant responses to that scene and to her character, because I think it's interesting. This is what this kind of research can do, sort of to get away from the big debate, the public debate, into how perhaps different audience members make sense of this. Next slide, please, Andrea. So just to say something first of all about Sansa as a favourite character, I've put together some things that people said about Sansa here, and you can see that although she was seen as a strong character, she was often described as being quite different from the other strong female characters in the series. So we have somebody here talking about her as a traditionally feminine character, not a badass character like Arya or Cersei. Somebody who is kind of more low-key, more like a real person, doesn't have magical skills, isn't able to fight, doesn't hold an existing position of power, isn't able to go out and travel the lands in the same way. So she's much more restricted, much more ordinary than other people, than other female characters. Participants often liked her and chose her as a favourite character because they felt that they could connect with her. She was more within their reach. And so it was they were able to kind of relate to her in a way that they, some of the larger than life characters. We have somebody here talking about Sansa as being very misunderstood and as not deserving the horrible things that happened to her. So whereas we have words like fierce and badass being used to describe other female characters, we have words like intuitive, vulnerable, empathic, and compassionate being used of Sansa. There's also a sense in which participants often saw Sansa more as kind of emblematic of women and their experiences. So not an exceptional woman, not the woman that proves the rule, but that, this is what it's like for women. They didn't. There's a sense that people didn't often enjoy her character in the way that they might relish Cersei's cunning and her badness, or Arya's aggression and revenge. But they say they kind of suffer alongside her. And there's sometimes a sense that she doesn't really belong in Game of Thrones, that she's strayed into the wrong series from somewhere else. She's very much a kind of fairy tale character, at least at the beginning. And that she therefore should not be treated like the other characters. She doesn't deserve to suffer the violence and the swift changes in fortune and the grim ends that other characters come to. Next slide, please, Andrea. So that's interesting in itself. I think that's been repeated twice. Is it possible to go forward? That's it, yeah. So the way that people perceived Sansa's nature was significant, and the way they understood the scene of her rape, it was also significant. One of the things we did, we attempted to measure the scenes that people found the most memorable, and they're in the first column here. And you can see the Red Wedding was seen as judged the most memorable scene. The most uncomfortable scene was judged to be Sansa's rape by Ramsay Bolton, with the Red Wedding coming a fairly close second to that. So you've got the scene and Sansa's character both indicate that people saw this as a particularly problematic form of representation around sexual violence. Next slide, please, Andrea. I think one of the things that's interesting is that we can see how the understanding of Sansa as having a different character to the other female characters is significant. And we've already seen that issues of style and adaptation are important in the way that people judge representations of sexual violence in the series. But I think what's also important to bear in mind is the way that the significance of sexual violence and its representation has perhaps changed over the years. So when we were studying this, we were very aware that, for example, the way that violence in general in media, or extreme media, or horrifying media, so genres like horror and pornography, for example, the way that we study those things has changed quite significantly over 10, 20 years. You know, we see those things as being quite complex now. But an earlier concern with violent media as just being problematic seems to have been transferred to media showing sexual violence. So there are things about the series itself that are significant in the way people understand this scene, but there are also things that are significant at this much broader level, the way that sexual violence is discussed generally and representations of sexual violence are discussed generally, that also provide a context for the way that audiences engage with this scene. And so, for example, the way that ideas about sexual objectification, the male gaze, sexualization have become very important, but very central, really, in the way that probably all forms of media are discussed now, provide the context for the way that people are judging these scenes. Next slide, please, Andrea. And that in particular, representations of rape have become really, really important. So they've almost come to stand for, when you're talking about feminist politics, feminist thinking, feminist media, it's debates about rape that sort of signify what that might mean, and far less attention is paid to reproductive rights, poverty, work conditions, other kinds of violence or suffering. It's rape that is what we look at when we want to talk about whether something's feminist or not, or when we want to judge how women are being represented. Tanya Horrock has this phrase, public rape. So this idea that rape has become a very public form of discourse. It's taken on massive significance in the way that lots of other kinds of representations haven't. And more recently, with the, in a digital age, public rape has become even more important. This idea of rape culture, issues of consent, issues of sexual violence being a real massive focus of discussion and debate, and something that circulates very quickly, feels very immediate, is very kind of present in the way people relate to these kinds of series. Okay, so let's look at some of the participants' responses to this scene. Next slide, please, Andrea. So here is a really interesting response, I think, that shows how some of the kinds of themes and discourses I've mentioned so far kind of play out in people's individual responses. So first of all, there are objections made which relate to things like adaptation and style. So it wasn't in the books. If it wasn't in the books, it shouldn't be in the series. That's an objection around adaptation and the way the scene is translated. There is a concern about the aesthetic of the way the scene is presented. There's concern about the trajectory of the narrative, about Sansa's character arc. So this participant she makes the claim the rape wasn't even necessary as a tragic motivator. So it doesn't work as a plot device. Sansa has already suffered huge losses, has been broken down in these ways. So these are kind of objections that are based on the way that the series is unfolding and issues around narrative and character. But we can also see how this participant then moves to this broader context of discourse. So some of the objections are not just about this series, this scene, this character, but about rape in general and representations in general. They say, I'm sick of rape being the only tragedy that could ever befall a woman, the only thing that could make her develop and become more interesting as a character. It's misogynist, it's a thinly veiled excuse for indulging in the male writer's rape fetish. It's lazy and unsympathetic, and ultimately it's unrealistic and shows a lack of comprehension or empathy for the real life impact of rape. So there's a move here from what's happening within the series to this kind of much broader staging of a debate about, well, how does rape function in general in the way that it's represented? What does it mean? And here it means it represents misogyny, it represents a rape fetish, it represents lack of empathy for real life victims of rape. This isn't just about the series then, or the character. Next slide, please, Andrea. The participant goes on and she talks about what rape does to victims. And she says that this kind of representation plays into the voyeuristic desires of the writers and the male audience. So we can see these concepts of objectification, rape culture, the male gaze, and so on being employed. And then in the final comment that's made here, rarely is rape depicted in visual media and not sexualized. Rape scenes are often filmed with the same angles and lighting as those used in consensual sex scenes, to me implying that the directors, writers, whoever else, don't genuinely differentiate rape and sex as experiences. And that's terrifying. I think what's really interesting here is that as these comments move away from the particular scene of Sansa and become much more about these general issues about representations of rape and what they might mean in a much broader sense, arguments are being made that clearly don't really apply to the scene at all, because this rape scene certainly wasn't filmed as a consensual sex scene. There's nothing about the angles or lighting that would suggest that. It doesn't read in that way, but it kind of doesn't matter because it is part of the way that the discourse around rape and sexual violence is playing out. So there are these different levels to what is being said, some of which relate to character, series, aesthetics, adaptation, and then this much broader discourse around rape. I think what's interesting about looking at these kinds of accounts is that they do help us to really unpick what's at stake when people talk about these kinds of big issues. You know, what is the nature of the claims that are being made? What kind of criteria are being used to judge what's debated? What's the terrain of debate? What's the frames of reference? And I think, you know, this is one of the reasons why we think this is an interesting project, because it can speak back to these broader questions of how we assess representations of women and of sexual violence. Next slide, please, Andrea. So I'm going to move into a comparison next of two different participants' responses, which are one of which is quite long, and I'll try and just pick out the key points, because I think these help us to unpick those issues in even more detail. So these are two responses to Sansa and to the scene of the rape. We've given them names, Hannah and Jessica. And just to sort of refer back to the way that we unpick those audience orientations, Hannah we classed as a world watcher, somebody who is very interested in the philosophical nature of the series and the possibilities that the narratives open up. Jessica belongs more to the classic fan orientation, who's very interested in doing things, making things around the series. There are some overlaps in the way they see the series as well, though. So you can see here that both of them, for example, describe Game of Thrones as a kind of medieval political drama, although they pick different descriptions for their other two key terms. I'll maybe come back to that. So these are what these two participants, this is how they kind of fit into our audience patterns. Next slide, Andrea. Thank you. So first of all, Jessica, and we can see this is quite similar actually to the previous participant response that I talked about. So she talks about Sansa and Cersei being her favourite characters, and the depiction of the sexual assaults in both cases of each character add nothing to the character. This idea that characters don't need to be raped to become empowered. So this idea of rape being used to develop people's character arcs, being used to set them on their road to empowerment is part of the way that this participant is analysing the scene. She goes on to say that for her, the most disturbing scene of the series was Sansa rape. It never happens to Sansa in the books. So there again is that issue around adaptation. Having to see a strong female character on her road to empowerment being torn down like that for no reason was terrible. And it's clear here from this response that there are some really strong ideas about how character arcs and roads to empowerment should play out, you know, as though there are some rules that should happen, and that in this case, they weren't applied. So empowerment has to take a particular form. I think what's interesting also here is the reference to Sophie Turner, the actress who plays Sansa. Sophie was just 18, so the depiction of the actress and her age becomes significant in explaining why this is such a problematic representation. Next slide, please, Andrea. If we look at Hannah's, this is a very long response. It's quite interesting for the similarities, but also the differences in Jessica's response. So first of all, we have a very lengthy discussion of Sansa's development of character. And it's seen as being particularly complex. So, for example, Hannah really empathizes with Sansa, but she's also seen as empowering. She keeps going no matter what. She's powerful as a feminist icon, and yet she's also vulnerable. Hannah wants to crawl through the pages of the screen and hug her and tell her that everything's going to be all right. She sees Sansa at different stages of her development. So she talks about younger Sansa, who reminds her of her younger sister, and who is wide-eyed and idealistic. Next slide, please. But she also sort of looks ahead to imagine how she might develop in forthcoming seasons. So she hopes that she will rule as Lady of Winterfell, possibly even as Queen in the North. She's also able to be critical of Sansa. She wants her to step up, blow everyone away with her political agency and capability. Next slide, please. So there are the kind of different levels to the way she's relating to the character and to the sort of her character at different stages on this journey to empowerment. She also has a lot to say about the actor Sophie Turner. She talks about her as a great actress. She talks about her persona. She seems fun to hang out with. She talks about the way that Sophie Turner talks about the Sansa Stark rape scene, and how that becomes part of the discussion about what can and can't be represented, and how it might relate to real life rape, how it might impact on real life rape survivors. So there's this other level of complexity there too, that she's kind of very, very much thinking inside the series and then outside the series. Next slide, please. Thank you. And she has particular kinds of hopes for Sansa, which shows that she's critical of her as well. So she wants her to turn away from the vicious, non-trusting traits instilled in her and retain aspects of her own humanity. She has hopes that she will, you know, stay friends with Jon, have happy life again, reunite with Arya, befriend Dany, and so on. And so she can project these positive futures, but she also at the same time worries that there might be a really grim ending ahead for Sansa. She thinks she has good odds of surviving the series, but she also thinks that perhaps she will die a slow, agonizing death, friendless and alone. So unpicking this second participant response, I think, is really interesting because of the different kinds of levels that the participant is moving between. Sometimes very personal, very based in the series, and sometimes moving outside of the series to think about the larger issues, including the way that sexual violence is represented. Next slide, please. And I'm going to end here, actually. I think what we have taken from this is that sometimes you get a real strong overlap between the way that public and academic discussions of things like sexual violence play out with what participants say. They use the same discourses, they use the same frames of references, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they talk about those things in very different ways, which are equally complex and aware and sensitive and kind of based not only in a reading of the series, but based in a politics, an engagement with the politics of representations of gender. One of the things that I think it does demonstrate is that there is a real danger, I think, of assuming that, for example, there is a feminist response to Game of Thrones or a feminist response to representations of rape, or that having a feminist response depends on making a particular set of moves in your discussion that rely on a particular ideal of how a character should develop, or a particular idea of what kinds of violence are permissible in media, or a particular kind of idea of what strength or femininity should look like and how they can be represented. There are different ways of making those claims and making those arguments. And I think that looking at participants' responses is a useful thing to do in order to kind of feed back into those larger discussions about representation, particularly about representations of women. Okay, I'm going to end there and hand over to Clarissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Andrea, are you going to put my slides up for me, please? So, as Fiona's been talking, you'll have seen that actually we've got a lot of very rich and complex materials in our database and in the book. And in these short presentations, we can't really, cover everything that has been really amazing about the research and what we found in there. So, really conscious of the fact that, like lots of audience research, trying to cram a bit into a half-hour presentation is actually really, it does quite a lot of violence to the actual work that we have. But anyway, I'm going to move on to some of the darker themes. Oh, well, actually, it's pretty dark, isn't it? Sexual violence. But I'm going to move on to the metaphorically dark things around Winter is Coming. So, Andrea, if you could press play on that clip, please, that would be great. If it will work. Ooh. Is it just my screen that's flashing like crazy?
Mine's not flashing.
Oh, is it not? Okay.
No.
Might be a good idea to just move on to the next slide, I think, because I don't. Right. Okay. So, if you saw the video, I don't know whether you did or not there, but the idea of Winter is Coming has become one of the kind of key, maybe even philosophies of Game of Thrones, and certainly during the period running up to season 6, 7, and 8. A number of international relations and political scholars were praising Game of Thrones as a means of examining the theoretical debates and global problems that they saw as existing in at this particular moment. The kind of idea that Tywin Lannister's cruel realism could be contrasted with other more justice-orientated rulers, or goals like vengeance, which might enable viewers, to debate the various merits of those forces for international politics. And this quote I've got here is from a guy called Matthew Reisner, who was Chief of Staff at America's Center for the National Interest, yet another of those conservative think tank bodies that exist in our world at the moment, calling for some really coercive powers, which, if we could have the next slide, Andrea, that would be great. Found their resonance in some of the memes that Game of Thrones gave rise to, such as this one, sanctions are coming. And if you could go to the next slide, Andrea, putting Trump as some kind of vengeance on snowflakes. And it's certainly, there's a really interesting range of ways in which some of the arguments are made about Game of Thrones as a possible metaphor for climate change. And in some ways, really thinking about why it is that, just as in Westeros, politicians are getting distracted by their own fights for power, when they're actually missing the major issue for human survival, right? So, and I think that, we can look at Game of Thrones as directly a kind of idea of climate change. There's more than that, I think, going on. Could we have the next slide, please, Andrea? Which, while this particular writer is talking about the ways that this pop cultural allusion to the global shift in the climate, there are other ways in which metaphor has been a part of people's understandings of Game of Thrones. So Winter is Coming is perhaps the most widely repeated of those, and has been used as a metaphor for other things. It does encapsulate the dark themes of impending doom. It's very difficult to say winter is coming without sounding, dour and like things are going to go very badly. And this is a saying that seems to confirm some of those researchers' claims that the effects of Game of Thrones lies in its affirmation that the world is cruel and unjust, and that followers of the story are kept waiting for justice, which never arrives. I should have asked you to move on to the next slide there. So that's in Anthony Gazinski's work, which we do actually engage with quite a lot in the book, and I'm not going to go into that in depth now for reasons of time. But the urge to find metaphorical meanings in Game of Thrones has definitely been very strong and insistent. And rather than think of this as just a kind of direct mapping or a really clear sense of, oh yeah, well, you know, here we are, we've got the White Walkers, you know, ice forming everywhere, then clearly it is climate change. We found that actually, in order for those metaphorical meanings to be mobilized, there are a range of different things that people were doing. There are ways in which 4 aspects come to the fore in their thinking. Firstly, how they pick and describe the lands or people that most intrigue them. There's also ways that people do think about winter in the series, but also what they think of as the world more generally around Westeros and Essos, and how they might relate that to our own world. And then also what that means in light of ideas about fantasy. And so really, we're suggesting that there's you know, it's important to understand that actually people didn't just talk directly about the show being a metaphor for our times, but that in fact it was much more complex than that. So, you know, we had moderate numbers who do talk about those connections to current real problems, and climate change was the top one, but it's only 220 mentions out of our more than 10,000 people. Global warming got around just over 100, and nuclear or atomic conflict was just under 100. Apocalypse was mentioned almost 200 times. But it's where there were a lot of kind of analogies to our world now, that seemed to be a lot to do with Donald Trump, which could be about the timing of our questionnaire, but also, you know, the fact that so many memes went live. But what we're seeing there really is what Milcaret has called pop cultural mobilization, where people are developing critical analogies using the show as a resource in order to be able to explain things that are going on in our world. So it wasn't just that our respondents are talking about Donald Trump as the kind of apocalypse that is the White Walkers. It's actually that was also happening across news reports and other places. And so we're seeing a reflection of that in our materials. And of course, metaphors have become a major field of study in their own right. I'm not going to go into great depth about that, but I think it's important to recognize how we might use fiction and how fiction is important to people's attempts to bring images and alignments together so that we can actually think about what's going on in our own world. And that we do that generally. And one of the things that we found here that really seemed to work for lots of our viewers was the ways in which they talked about other cultures. And I'm not going to go into any great depth about this. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things, short elements here. So, for example, when they talked about cultures such as the Dothraki or wildlings, many respondents talked of them as a site of emotion, fascination, comparison, and evaluation. So we find a lot of people talking in terms of, as this person does, I'm just going to read this quote. It's really close between the wildlings and the Dothraki. The wildlings for their great diversity. I would like to know more about each of the cultures and clans, but the Dothraki are just viscerally entertaining to watch. And for many people, there's kinds of shared affinities that they tell us about, and a sense of difference that gives the Dothraki, for example, their interest. So someone talking about being from Finland, and so, you know, they feel a closeness to the Starks for that reason, that they're stubborn and honest like Finns. But then the Dothraki are maybe more interesting to that person because they are so different. It's not just about feelings, of course, when people are talking about emotional responses. They're often referencing critical and political elements as well, and thinking more broadly there about how people talked of particular lands or people. And when it came to the Dothraki, there were quite a number of our respondents who talked about them as particular kinds of outsiders. And for example, in one respondent's words, they stood out in the world of white characters with royal clothes and formality. They were the most exotic and looked down upon from the mainstream society. And so in those kinds of answers, we're able to see what kinds of qualities people are seeing in the various cultures, and also whether they view these positively or negatively, and how these add up, and then how some definite patterns emerged for us. So, for example, the Starks and the North are valued for their openness and honesty, their sense of old world traditions. And many people who talked about liking the Starks often want to claim some sort of likeness to them, just as actually we found in relation to individual characters, particularly the female characters of Arya and Sansa. Wildlings are almost the opposite. They're admirable people, but they live under such harsh conditions that it's really hard for people to imagine being like them. The Dothraki are exotic, and so much so that they risk being seen as savages. And for many of our respondents who talk about those issues, these are real problems for them in terms of the representation that's offered. And then others such as Bravos and the Faceless Men, the Dornish, are fascinating precisely because they're not really well understood. The Dornish are understood to be a very woke community, but for many as well, Dawn is measured against an ideal and found very wanting because it doesn't go far enough, particularly in terms of its kind of sexual freedoms and stuff. So could we have the next slide, please? And this is something actually that became really important to us in thinking about the ways in which where people talked about very strong associations with particular lands and peoples, then we found a real likelihood of wanting to talk even further about those cultures and to understand them in terms of metaphor, so that it's not really that they're actually saying so much, I want to be Dothraki or I see myself as Dothraki, but what does the Dothraki open up for thinking about in terms of the world that we live in? And certainly this was something that HBO exploited in their posters for season 7, which kind of, I've only got a small selection of those there, which kind of posit to people imagine really what is going to be the response of each of these individual characters to the idea that winter is here. So next slide, please. And I'm really aware I'm going to run out of time. We asked the question, it's question 24 of the questionnaire, that it was a wild card question for us, really. And that is, winter is coming. It's probably the most famous thing from the series, but what is winter? What does it make you think of? We got a number of really great answers to this, actually, with people also saying to us, this was a really good question, hadn't thought about it before, it's making me think in very different ways. But not everyone answered the question as well, right? I mean, I think that's important to note. We found that about 15% either left the answer blank or said they weren't sure how to answer the question. 1 or 2 said that it was stupid. as a question to ask, and others, it was clear that really they'd kind of been worn out by the answers they'd already given. Right? So our first category when we came to kind of dividing these up was no answer or not analysable. But could you move the, yeah, thank you. Oh, I seem to have lost one of those there. So our 6 categories were no answer, not analysable, followed by doom, story focused, metaphors, analogy, survival, renewal and hope. And the 6th one is mundane and resistant. So if we could move to the next slide, please, doom. These were characterized really by their kind of short answers with kind of predictions, really. So it's, you know, doom, death, the end. And, you know, that one there, doom for everyone, is quite interesting in the ways that it kind of dramatizes the answer. And dark, death and doom is kind of like, let's just accumulate everything there. Next slide, please. The next one is story focus, and these, of course, are pointing really to characters or events within Game of Thrones. You know, the shortest of these would mention the White Walkers or the others, but more complicated answers such as these make reference for the Starks, and that idea that this is their saying and that it really matters for them. And there are also quite a lot of predictive or speculative answers as well in relation to this question from this group of people. Next slide, please. Within metaphors and analogies, these are answers that offer one or two ways of reading winter as symbolic or as a kind of forms of representation, as we see here. So, you know, it's winter is anything inevitable that you're dreading. It's your taxes, it's Donald Trump, it's whatever is looming over your shoulder. And about the idea of taking responsibility and getting your shit together. Next slide, please. The survival, renewal and hope is both a gloom-filled answer, but also that there's something beyond winter, a kind of idea of spring. And it's a kind of idea that, an uncertain idea really, but that something might be coming, right? Summer is coming in this one, or the idea of breaking the wheel. You know, if we had more time, we'd be talking about the ways in which this might sit very strangely with the pleasures that people take in the idea of doom overall in the series, and their particular pleasures in the idea of the grim dark. And there's kinds of hesitations and uncertainties in these kinds of answers. Could we have the next slide, please? So, you know, the use of the words hope. I hope this remains only a fascinating story and not a harbinger of things to come in our own world, but also that there's a kind of sense of this world also hanging in the balance there. Could you move the next slide on? And again, here there's, you know, about hitting very low points and you can always get back and there's always hope. We can't really be sure what the politics are that underpin these answers, and it's really, most of these answers give little indication of what critical position is generating their kind of fears and hopes that are being articulated here, but there are those in these answers, and perhaps that's something that we need to look at later. And some other research. Next slide, please. And then our last group is the mundane or resistant. And these are the number of participants who write with a very clear sense of what they believe we were looking for, and they absolutely declined to provide it. So instead of talking about the series or metaphorical or other meanings, they insist on talking about their own experiences of winter. So, you know, it's Christmas. So King in the North here is Santa Claus, right? Could we move on, please? So I think what's important for us really in these different sets of responses, and in this one here, is this kind of way in which people, many people were telling us that taking part in discussions about the show's value or its importance is a kind of norm of viewing, that actually to view the series and to enjoy debating its merits and faults with relatives, friends, online contacts, and in our research is a kind of cultural bog standard. And so, you know, one of the things that we're seeing is this kind of real ease of moving between the series on its own terms and engaging with it as a metaphor. And so you can see that in this one here, where it's, you know, it's a season. So for us, thank God it's just ended. But it also makes me think of the cold, White Walker's death, big bad ice enemies, and then, you know, I want to go on a holiday, and then back to the series, who cares if they screw goats in Dawn. So, you know, we're seeing a range of really interesting movements there. And if we could move to the next slide, I think one of the things that we found particularly important about the research was the ways in which it isn't just classic fans, or, you know, a group that we would isolate as fans right at the start, who were showing the highest levels of engagement with the story itself. In fact, we see a whole range of people who are willing to really, you know, tease out elements of Game of Thrones and want to talk about it in different ways. What does identify fans as different is that they are less willing to reduce winter to kind of these short dramatic epithets. For them, actually, it's winter's role and place within the world of the story, its characters and conflicts, really captures them. And so this answer is an indication of that kind of orientation to the show, where conscious referencing of characters, sayings and events acknowledges some of the parallel possibilities to our world, but actually it's much more about the show itself. And for some reasons, that is one of the reasons, actually, maybe, that we started to find ourselves most interested in a group that we called the Fan Watchers, who seem most intrigued by the possibilities of survival, renewal and hope. More than 20% of them volunteered answers with that dimension in them, and they gave incredibly long answers. They also made highest levels of reference to metaphors and analogies. So they seem to be the group with the greatest commitment to reading beyond the series world and valuing doing that and that enjoyment, and thinking about the series as commentary. And, you know, there's a seriousness about many of their answers in relation to this. And one of the things that we would want to indicate, and that we do in the book, is that it becomes very important for this group to talk in terms of worlds. And it's not necessarily that they're talking in terms of the world as, you know, being entirely coherent, and they're not arguing over whether or not Tyrion has a gold sword or a silver sword or whatever, you know, the kinds of details that we might see fans worrying about. But actually it's about the ways in which they want to talk and explain their views, and it's a kind of discursive confidence that this group has that we find really interesting. Could we move to the next slide, please? And this is an example of world talk. And it's a real articulation, actually, of the play of ideas about the notion of the world. Here's a structured entity with rules and forces in which humanity is being tested. And it's a fantasy world, for sure, but it's designed to test humans. And that is a parallel to our world, where we're also being tested. Will we wipe it and ourselves out? Okay. So all of these are really, you know, I hope you're seeing, even though I'm really skirting over some of the arguments here, and I've had to diminish our discussion of fantasy quite considerably, but it does point to the ways in which ideas of fantasy is really complicated. It's not just sets of ideas that impose themselves on impressionable viewers. We really do need to think about how fantasy, how metaphor, how understandings of world building and people's immersions in a TV series like Game of Thrones can contribute really to people's sense of both, you know, the fantasy itself, but also our world, its peoples and problems. For too long, there's been that idea that fantasy is just self-indulgent, undisciplined, near pointless. Of course, unless it was bad, such as sexual fantasy, in which case we need to worry about it as a threat. For many people, that idea has faded somewhat, but it hasn't entirely disappeared. And, you know, there's one of the things that we wanted to achieve in this was to try and understand how engaging in fantasy, having an understanding of fantasy, might guide and shape people's responses to Game of Thrones. And one of the things that we think we have found here is a desire for more and more depth, for complex storylines, for really detailed characterization, for well-embroidered imagined worlds. And the effects of this are an intensity of involvement and immersiveness and getting caught up in the rich detail. And, you know, this is really important for understanding how people made sense of Winter is Coming, that actually the more involved somebody was, the more immersed they were in the idea of the world, or the more they had understood certain characters as being important and interesting and revealing something, the more likely they were to understand Game of Thrones as offering particular ways of understanding our world. And that is not the same as people like Gajinsky and others see it as just a kind of fatalistic idea that comes to the fore. So we named this group who kind of in our overall orientations, fan watchers. But we actually found towards the end of the project that it was inadequate for understanding them, that actually that group need to be called world watchers. And everything in and around the world of Game of Thrones interests people who we've identified as world watchers. And that includes how fans relate to the series. So they're not just watching the series, they're not just paying attention to the ways in which it enters different debates about, you know, is it metaphorical, but also they're paying attention, as we demonstrate in the book, to how fans are talking about the show, or what fans are doing. So one of the things that's so amazingly interesting about them is that they are fascinated by the possibilities of a narrative of this kind and the world it creates in front of them. And that's why we find them fascinating. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Is there time to have, oh God, 3 minutes to have some questions? I'm so sorry.
So we'll try and hopefully get some questions. Thank you both very much. Absolutely fascinating. Also can't wait to pick up the book as well. So I have a hand up here from Michael, if you'd like to put your mic and camera on.
Hi both, thank you very much. I'll be quick. My question regards TV audiences and the theme of trust, and I'm wondering to what extent your research findings spoke to this theme of a sort of trust or bond between TV audiences. And you know, I'm thinking with Game of Thrones, you know, it's a show that people took really personally, as if it was a betrayal, as if they developed a trust with, you know, one of the most unpredictable and untrustworthy programs since, I don't know, Hill Street Blues or Saint Elsewhere or something, where they kill off main characters and so on. And whereas for others, and this is increasingly the case with some of my students, they won't watch it because they expect their trust to be betrayed. And I was wondering, you know, how can we sort of understand this in the context of both TV history, but I guess wider, you know, culturally, this theme of trust? First question I've ever asked that. So.
Yeah, I will answer that, if that's all right with you, Fiona, is it? Yeah, okay. So, well, we completed the research before season 8 landed, or we closed the questionnaire before season 8 landed, and in some ways we were, you know, really disappointed that we'd done that, but also at the same time actually really delighted, because by the time season 8 concluded, I don't think anybody was talking about any of the other issues to do with the season, previous seasons. It was just all about how season 8 had done the dirty on those, or whether or not it had. And it actually forms a postscript of the work. There is a chapter that actually explores all of that in our book. I mean, it is really interesting to think about how people were so upset by what happened in Game of Thrones. And certainly, you know, we did some work on the petition that came out after season 8, or as season 8 was ending. And it's full of how dare they do this to us? I've wasted 10 years of my life. Well, not quite that. Was it 8 years? Something like that. No, it was 10 years of my life. But, you know, one of the things that we were interested in looking at that is not whether or not people are right to say this, or whether or not, you know, this means that the series is dreadful and it's got nothing to do, but what kinds of languages they were using. And there was both fans as deserving, but there was also characters as deserving as well, and that these were different levels. Now, you've asked us a question there that I think goes beyond what we managed to think about, but I do think that it's really interesting to think about how there are different levels of idea of desert. There's the fans, what they deserve. There's the story, what does it deserve? There's the characters, what do they deserve? What did George R.R. Martin deserve? You know, there's a whole range of things. And, you know, it does indicate something really important about recognizing how important these kinds of series are to people, not just the people who are viewing, because also in that petition, there were lots of people saying, you know, I've never watched it, and now I won't. It's like, well, I won't watch it until you remake it. It's like, well, you know, yeah. So, yeah, this it's fascinating. I don't have an answer. That's the thing. But I think in the very fact that there isn't an answer to that, or we don't have an answer, is really amazingly interesting too. Right?
It really is, and I find it really frustrating then with students who aren't sort of willing to engage in that conversation. It's almost as if the conversation has ended there on Game of Thrones, which I found when I began teaching, you know, it was still on air. As soon as it came off air, people just stopped talking about it.
Yeah.
And it's this current sort of generation of students, which, you know, I'm not going to sort of use the phrase cancelling, but they very much, I don't know, they did take it out of the discourse. It came out of a popular cultural discourse, you know, it disappeared from a sort of TV discourse, or there was an absolute unwillingness to engage, you know, sometimes in a quite a forceful unwillingness. But I mean, it's a conversation to pick up.
Yeah.
Use the 3 minutes.
Thank you. Elka will tell me if we have time for any more questions with a nod or a.
I think we can have one more, maybe.
If anybody else has got a burning question that they'd like to ask,
Mhm.
then please do put your hand up.
Did I see a hand? No. Can I just say one thing about the because I think Michael does raise a really interesting issue, because when we were writing the book, when we were doing the research, you know, it felt like that it would be received, you know, with quite a lot of fanfare. And then actually trying to get any publicity for the book has been really difficult, because actually most of those spaces have now said everything has been said about Game of Thrones, right? So, you know, the conversation, which will normally just take anything from any no, that sounds rude, but I have written for the conversation, so I think I can say that as well. They just told us, oh, there's nothing more to say about Game of Thrones, which is like, oh, okay. And maybe there isn't, because actually in lots of ways our approach is about complexity, and lots of media outlets want to be able to say, oh yeah, it is feminist, or it isn't feminist, or it was racist, or it's not racist, or, you know, women hated it, or, you know, whatever. They want to have those kinds of answers about it. But, you know, there's some really fascinating, I do think our postscript is really interesting about what it highlights around some of those questions that were raised in the petition about having this show remade. Yeah, and I think when the spin-offs come, it'll be very interesting. You know, I'd be interested to know how many Sky viewers are watching Game of Thrones now, as it just runs on these kinds of repeats, you know. But yeah, it is fascinating that it's kind of dropped out of the space. And yeah.
Elke, did you want to come in on that? Please do.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, particularly in the light of what Fiona said about the kind of the presentness of the debates that were had, and that sense of being in there right now and all of that. Do you think it might be connected to this and the particular forms of television as well? You know, that television is something that is very now, and it is still connected to ideas of liveness, even though obviously we can now time shift everything, but there's still this kind of time limitedness to it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you know, the idea of metaphor and the analogies with Trump and stuff. Well, of course, you know, now we're supposedly in a nicer period with Biden and itchy beard, really. Not so much the Biden actually is, you know, in this country, the things that we're seeing really at this point, it feels very odd that Game of Thrones is not being used as analogies still. But anyway, there we are. It's yeah. But yeah, there is maybe there's a space, isn't there? That's maybe where the spin-offs will come in and have some importance. But yeah, I mean, you know, I guess in some ways that is part of the thing around everything's been already said, you know, and so it belongs to the kind of Trump thing. We're trying to draw a line under Trump and move on.
Claire has added to the chat there that it's amazing that even the shame walk meme has left the online conversations.
Yeah. Yeah.
The political discourse is fascinating, I think, if you don't mind me just and I think, you know, when we consider, you know, these books were written, well, the first book was released a year before the sort of Clinton scandal, so it's released in a pretty piecemeal time. The TV series is released in 2011. You know, it's a fairly patriotic time. It's a time when America kind of feels okay. It's, you know, it's negotiated its position on sort of aggression overseas. You've got the assassination of bin Laden that year. You know, it's very much a year that coincides with a happy period. And in the same way that, you know, something like, I don't know, The West Wing functioned in the 1990s as a sort of an alternative fantasy then during years of scandal, it's almost as if Game of Thrones is like almost subverted the sort of norms in which it's sort of, at least around the time of its release, it's kind of subverted the sort of actual world, and it's kind of given us an alternative sort of perspective, an alternative politics. And it's interesting then to see it go through the sort of Trump years. And it's interesting to see the discourse around it transform from a celebration of unpredictability, from almost a thirst for the aesthetics of excess, of, I don't know, representations, and to see that transform as the show goes through new politics, and new social politics as well, social political movements. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating show, and I think it's kind of, it's incredibly rich. We got, 8 years of a series to study and 8 years of history to look at alongside and after it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a way in which we might sometimes read too directly onto it and from it backwards, but I do think that there's a lot of just such fascinating and rich detail in people's talk, particularly about characters and incidences that happen to them, and that in the book we can't cover most of that. They really would encourage people to go and have a look at the database and see whether or not they'd want to dive into it themselves, because there's such a lot of stuff in there about and particularly around people like Dany and also Jon Snow, and the kind of ideas of the ideal hero, and that sense that actually we are living through Trump times, and maybe we deserve something better in our fiction, that things would work out with the proper hero, which I mean is intriguing, given, as you say, lots of people certainly really loved the unpredictability of the show and talked about it as, if you think this has a happy ending, you've not been paying attention, and yet they did want a happy ending. Marriage of Jon Snow and Daenerys, their children, and the dragons living happily ever after. It's kind of wow. But of course I say that and I'm laughing because I really wanted Cersei to come out on top and no one else to be left. Which probably says something terrible about me, but there we are. It's not for psychoanalyzing. We don't do that in the book. I mean, so it's rich, definitely, isn't it, Fiona? We've got lots in there. So buy the book.
I
was just going to remind everyone to do that. Thank you. Yeah. I want to thank our presenters again, Fiona and Clarissa, for absolutely fascinating material, and the book is going to be really, really great. And thanks to all our guests as well, and for the questions and comments too. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks.